That's better. Here we go. It's better now. It should be picking up the microphone. It should better sound pick up. This is the same story as last time. I don't know why I would be contracted before. Is it still really bad?
Is this any better now? Oh, thanks, Maddie. Does it sound better? All right, let's try to start this then. Get my ugly face off the screen. All right, so I know next time I have to. Thank you, John. I know next time I have to plug these things in before I start the conversation. Um, Give me an idea on the lag when you hear this type poo. Wow, okay, that's a big lag. Now you guys are having too much fun typing the word poo over and over again. Okay, so we're on about a minute lag, so I'll probably do less Q&A and more just me babbling. All right, stop typing poo. All right, so what I've done today is divided this up into just your major topic areas that you need to know for the test on probably Monday. I'm assuming, based on what's happening outside and the forecast in general, that I will not be seeing you guys until Monday. So until we find out otherwise, that's what we'll go with. Thank you, David. I am very YouTube famous. So with imperialism, the things you need to know about the spam war. You need to know about why we went there. You've got the issues with Cuba and the Spanish being in Cuba, and we want to toss them out. Then from the with the Spanish American War, you need to know concepts like yellow journalism. You need to know. Oops. You need to know. You need to know about the Maine, the USS Maine, and the sinking of the Maine. Know about Teddy and his Rough Riders, and then the main part of the Spanish American War that you need to know is the Treaty of Paris and the fallout from that, where Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico are all granted their quote unquote independence, and then we decide no, you don't actually need that independence. We're essentially going to colonize you. Have an idea of the timeline on the Philippines and when they do finally get their independence. With Roosevelt and Taft, make sure that you know that Taft was supposed to be Roosevelt's successor. Roosevelt doesn't think he's doing a very good job, so he's going to come back in the picture. And then with Teddy, know that he did, big stick diplomacy. The Roosevelt corollary, where we are not going to colonize Latin American countries, but we will intervene militarily if we have to. So that's your quick summary of imperialism. Any questions on imperialism? Yellow journalism. Dan, everything I'm doing is on the test. Yellow journalism is when newspapers, remember, are competing to sell papers, and they want to make as much money as they can. And so they would kind of sensationalize headlines. Yellow journalism is sensationalizing headlines to sell newspapers. For instance, with the explosion of the Maine, They just quickly declared that the Spanish did it, didn't really bother to check sources, figure out if that's what actually happened. And it's the big competition between Pulitzer and Hearst to sell newspapers. So again, yellow journalism sensationalizing headlines to sell newspapers, and war, blood, and guts all sell. So they make sure to emphasize those, which leads us into the Spanish-American War. The Philippines gains independence in 1946. This is after World War II, when most people are kind of cutting their colonies loose and focusing on the idea of self-determination. So Philippine independence, 1946, maybe 45. But the big idea is that, we recognize that, maybe they deserve this independence. Any other questions on imperialism before we move into World War I? Taft just basically didn't impress Roosevelt. Roosevelt felt like he should have done more foreign policy wise, should have been a little bit more progressive, and he just wasn't good enough for Roosevelt's liking. He didn't do anything terrible, really. He just wasn't very remarkable. Jess, the Treaty of Paris. This Treaty of Paris is the one that ends the war, grants some areas their independence that we renege on. All right, I'm going to move into World War I now. If you still have questions on progressives or on, I'm moving into the progressive age. If you have questions on imperialism, feel free to continue asking, and I'll do my best to answer. Progressive age, you're dealing with mass production again. This is a little bit of spillover from the Gilded Age. AP probably should have lumped progressive in with Gilded, just because progressive is basically the response to all the issues in the Gilded Age. So with the progressive age, we move into it with two big things. One is the introduction of mass production, your assembly line and Ford. The assembly line and Ford, where big business is really taking over. And with urbanization, remember, everybody's moving into the cities at this point. The United States, to the point of the Gilded Age, had largely been agrarian, meaning that they're working on farms. But with the factory movements, people start moving to the cities because that's where the factories are, setting up tenement housing and that sort of stuff. And remember, that's usually factory-owned, company-owned housings, and not much safety. Remember Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. There's issues with that. So once everybody's in these cities, people are becoming aware of the problems, and that's where we start to see the response to the Gilded Age, where you have these progressive reformers coming about. A progressive reformer, usually from the city, usually middle class, occasionally female, actually often female, and usually led by this group of journalists called muckrakers. Remember, muckrakers originally meant to be an insult but they begin to wear it with a badge of honor. The idea is that they are raking up muck. They're going to the bottom of the barrel and exposing all the negative things that people in industry are doing. So your big reformers, or at least the ones that shed light on the need for reform, known as muckrakers during the Progressive Age. The government is still relatively laissez-faire. Roosevelt definitely starts intervening, and later Taft is going to intervene. Wilson's going to get even more involved in the laws that are passed here. The major laws to concern yourself with here in the Progressive Age, you have the Clayton Antitrust Act. Those of you that wrote the DBQ yesterday dealt with that. I think it was document 6. And the Clayton Act is meant to clarify the Sherman Antitrust Act. Basically, it gives it a little bit more teeth. Some of the things in it, you're not allowed to be on the board of 2 companies if the companies are merging together. You're not allowed to fix prices or force people to buy bundles of goods across different industries. So that's the Clayton Antitrust Act. You also need to know in this age, the 2 major amendments to the Constitution. First being the 16th Amendment, allowing for a federal income tax. Jacob's asking about specific reformers. No, well, yes and no. I would know, just like we talked about with the New Deal, I would know 2 or 3 reformers and know what they did really well. That way, if you get a short answer about it or a long essay or DBQ in the future, you can pull one of those reformers out and be able to talk about them. Definitely know Upton Sinclair. Definitely know Teddy Roosevelt. But know a couple just so you can bring them into the conversation during a short answer question. So back to your 2 amendments. 16th Amendment allows for a federal income tax. If the government is going to start doing all this oversight of business, somebody needs to pay for it, and the way they pay for it is by introducing the federal income tax. Prior to this, taxes were basically sales taxes, property taxes, and those sorts of things. The income tax injects a lot of money into the government very quickly. Also helps to pay for World War I. The 17th Amendment, again, progressive reforms don't just target industry, they also target the government. And there's a lot of corruption within the government, especially at local levels. And the 17th Amendment allows for direct election of senators. Essentially what was happening is the state legislatures, remember, originally elected senators, and governors were starting to get involved, and business was supposed to get in their pockets, and basically putting forward senators that business leaders liked. They weren't necessarily elected to represent the people, they were representing business. We still see issues with that today. When Barack Obama became president, his Senate seat was vacated. And the governor in Illinois was then allowed to appoint the next senator to replace him. And the guy's name was Rob Blagojevich, and he ended up being arrested for essentially selling Barack Obama's Senate seat. So even after the Gilded and Progressive Ages, we still have issues with appointment of senators when they aren't directly elected by the people. That ends my Progressive Age babble, and we'll open to questions. For 17, Maddie, yeah, Roosevelt is pretty big on pushing it. The other presidents after Roosevelt are pretty much in agreement with that. Taft and Wilson are in agreement that it's something that's necessary to happen. Rebecca, again, with mass production, just know that it leads to an increased number of people working in the factories, allows goods to be produced more quickly, which means we can sell more goods around the world and within the United States. But, no Ford, and that's about it. Jen, very good question about the DBQ. If you wrote 16th Amendment instead of 17th Amendment, do you fail? My understanding from the College Board on that is if you correctly describe the amendment, you're not going to lose credit for mismarking it. I wouldn't encourage mismarking it, but my understanding is they'll grade the stuff that you did right, not necessarily penalize the stuff you did wrong, if that makes any sense. Scott, with mixing up yellow journalism and muckrakers, though, that is going to be a big issue. I'll have to see how you did it, but that will be a big issue. John, yes, conditions were pretty close to Gilded Age ones. Even with the progressive reforms, the government is still relatively hands-off with the industry. Really, it's not until the 70s that they're super hands-on with business industry when we get the Environmental Protection Agency up and running. But yeah, still living in tenement housing all the way through the Great Depression. Reagan, yes, we don't necessarily struggle with the 17th Amendment today, but you see when you don't have direct elections, yes, Reagan, that is why I rambled about Obama's Senate seat. When you don't have direct elections, you're still going to have some issues with Senate seats. So let's head to World War I. Let's move to World War I here. You need to know that the American forces in World War I are referred to as the American Expeditionary Force. It's kind of a blend of the Marines and the Army on land. And you need to know that their role is essentially to go over there and be fat. They really just kind of inject some morale into the Allied troops and take away some morale from the Germans. And just know, yeah, that their role isn't really huge in winning the war. It's not like they introduce new tactics or anything. They try the same thing over and over again. You should also know that the Lusitania, as well as the Zimmerman note, bring us into the war. Remember, the Lusitania is an English, essentially, cruise ship that has Americans on board that is sunk by a German U-boat. And when Americans are killed by a German submarine, that's when people start to get a little bit angry and become more in favor of the war. Remember, Wilson wants to avoid entering the war at all costs. America's very isolationist at this point. They view it as Europe's problem. With civil liberties at home, you've got the Espionage Act and the Sedition Acts. You also have the 18th Amendment passed during this time. That's your prohibition of alcohol. So civil liberties, just like in the Civil War, just like it's going to be in World War II, civil liberties very restricted during World War I. We just see another case of, if a war is happening, we have no problem taking away rights from people. The Great Migration, that is when African Americans move from the South to northern cities in order to work in factories. They are essentially replacing soldiers. Women also replace soldiers. I don't know what you guys are talking about with cookies, but it doesn't make any sense, and it's making me hungry, so stop. So where was I? Oh yeah, Great Migration. African Americans coming north to take the factory jobs that are left by soldiers that have headed overseas to fight. 14 points. Remember, Wilson's plan to end the war. With Treaty of Versailles, you need to know first that it's negotiated poorly because you only have the major three powers involved: the United States, France, and Great Britain. Germany is left out in the cold. Italy, Japan are completely ignored. So people are very angry about the Treaty of Versailles and its aftermath. You also need to know that Wilson is unable to sell it back home. It's rejected because of the League of Nations. And also know that Henry Cabot Lodge was very much against the Treaty of Versailles. And in fact, if we weren't out of school every other day, we would have done we would have had another round of speeches with Wilson versus Lodge, where they're going back and forth and debating what should be done with the Treaty of Versailles. League of Nations, remember, it's an even weaker version of the United Nations, where you need universal approval in order to pass anything, and it's also not funded because the United States doesn't join, and they're the only ones with money to fund it at that point in history. We want to stay isolationists after the war. We want Europe to deal with Europe and us to be left alone. But one thing we do sign, one treaty we do sign in the late 20s, in the aftermath of World War I, is called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And this is where every country in the world gets together and signs a treaty that says we will never go to war again. We will not use war as a means to settle disputes. Everybody signed it. There was no consequence for breaking it. So, as usual, when there's no consequence for breaking something, it is immediately broken by Adolf Hitler with the onset of World War II. And I will pause now for questions before we get into the 1920s. So Reagan's asked about prohibition, if it's always ignored, if it was always ignored the way it was in the 20s. Reagan, yeah, prohibition was essentially ignored from the outset. It's largely approved through state legislatures, not through direct votes. And it's a way for people to make money. I mean, selling liquor on the black market was incredibly profitable. So selling liquor illegally was very profitable. You don't have to pay the government any taxes. And it's, I mean, it is what leads to, NASCAR and whatnot when you have the moonshiners trying to outrun the law. It was just too profitable. It was too profitable to sell illegal alcohol for it to actually work. As far as the 14 points go, you just need to know that it's Wilson's plan and that the League of Nations were a part of it. Dan asked why the Great Migration didn't happen earlier, because World War I caused a lot of people to leave their jobs in factories, so there were jobs available up north. Prior to that, there was no incentive to leave the South to go north, because soldiers, well, people who hadn't yet become soldiers were holding those jobs. And yes, Jess and Jacob are correct. Henry Cabot Lodge is the guy that does not like the Treaty of Versailles on the American front. See, I don't even need to be here. I'll just leave Jess and Jacob to answer all the questions. All right, let's hit the 20s. 1920s. We are back to isolationism. We don't want anything to do with Europe. We're not going to have anything to do with Europe until Hitler starts making noise. Rebecca asked if we need to know examples of civil liberties being taken away. Absolutely. The nice thing for you guys is that they are almost always called sedition acts or espionage acts or something along those lines. So you're you don't have a whole lot to kind of memorize. Just know that there was a sedition act for a whole bunch of wars. Jess asked if the civil liberties thing is like habeas corpus. Yes, that is correct, Jess. The civil liberties, just like when Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus in the Civil War. So also coming along in the 20s, you have new technology. You have the radio becoming more and more of a player. It's especially going to become important during the Roosevelt administration when he does his fireside chats. But Roosevelt can't do fireside chats without election results being announced in the 20s, just like you guys saw in the video in class. You have a lot of time between now and then. Probably not a bad idea to watch all of those Century videos. They are on the YouTube playlist on Haiku. Also invented at this point in time is motion pictures. This is your Steamboat Willie and those sorts of things. If you've taken Shep's class, motion pictures have been around for a while. Like we said, Wilson watched Birth of a Nation in the White House when it first came out. But in the 20s, you start to see Nickelodeons come about. That's theaters where you could see 2 movies for a nickel. You'd usually get your news during the movies as well. So motion pictures really explode in the 20s. When we talk about conflict in the 20s, you've got your black versus white conflict. Remember, this is when the Klan reemerges, and many people throughout the country are Klan members. As always, you have your conflict with immigrants. Remember, in the 20s, that's when we decided we hate Italians and Chinese and Japanese. We talked last time about the idea of the Irish forcing Italians into the basement to attend Mass on Sundays because they didn't want to be associated with them. You also have the conflict science versus religion. You're going to have the Scopes monkey trial in the 20s. And I mean, you still see a lot of this today with the evolution debate. That all started back in the 1920s. And then you have your first Red Scare. We do not want communism. We like our laissez-faire capitalism. In the 20s, we hadn't had the stock market crash yet, so people are doing pretty well with that. Last thing you need to know out of the 20s is the idea of the Harlem Renaissance and jazz and the emergence of black culture in Harlem starting to bleed over into white culture, and that's going to help pave the road 40 years later for the civil rights movement. That's it on the 20s. I will stop and wait for questions. Scott asked why we don't talk about gangsters. We just did talk about gangsters when we talked about Prohibition. It will, if you know the Capone story, great example to bring up when you talk about Prohibition, the Valentine's Day Massacre, and all those sorts of things. Again, that's something where if we had more time, then we would have dealt with it more in depth. Maddie asked what was the Red Scare again. That's the first time when we are trying to filter communists out of our government. You can look up the Sacco and Vanzetti trial for that one for a little bit more information on the Red Scare. That was mentioned on the review sheet that I gave you to work on Tuesday. Jacob asked, wasn't the Red Scare just kind of like the Salem witch trials where you're being prosecuted for no good reason? That's a good synthesis as well. Scott, McCarthyism is also a Red Scare. This is the first Red Scare that we're talking about that happens in the early 1920s. The second Red Scare with McCarthy is going to happen in the 50s. So multiple Red Scares that you have to be aware of. Again, look at your document outline. Austin asked about why the Klan popped up again in the 20s. And if they were, the Klan was essentially against anybody that was not a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. They hate Catholics, they hate Jews, and they hate African Americans, and they hate pretty much all immigrants. And you got to remember, the reason they focus on African Americans, same reason that African Americans are slaves. You can tell an African American is an African American. You can't necessarily tell that a white person is Italian or Irish or anything along those lines. Why are you asking about the Crucible, Jess? Um, so yeah, so part of the reason the Klan pops back up in the 20s is a little bit is boredom, a little bit is these African Americans have taken factory jobs, and now these soldiers are coming home, and now you've got the conflict of who gets that job. Same with women. So that's wraps up the Klan talk. All right, let's move on to the Great Depression. So, Great Depression, essentially starting point Black Tuesday. That's when the stock market crashes. Remember, Hoover is your president at this point. And essentially, tent cities start to pop up around the United States. There's one prominently on the Mall in Washington, D.C. They refer to these as Hoovervilles, essentially blaming Hoover for their conditions at any given time. Dust Bowl is just something. The Great Depression doesn't cause the Dust Bowl, and the Dust Bowl doesn't cause the Great Depression. The Dust Bowl is caused by essentially overplanting and a lack of crop rotation throughout the western part of the United States, and it just serves to exacerbate the Great Depression and make things worse. You have these terrible economic conditions, and all of a sudden you also have massive drought and crops not being able to grow. That's going to lead to major issues around the country. So the Dust Bowl basically just serves to make things even worse than they were. New Deal. I would know 3 or 4 of your alphabet soup programs beyond the FDIC and Social Security. Again, FDR is one of your 6 presidents that they can ask specifically about, and being able to name this New Deal stuff and describe it will help you greatly on the AP test with all of your writing sections. So know, your CCC, your AAA, the Tennessee Valley Authority is one that the AP seems to love, so make sure you know them, especially since they're still around today. 2 specifically mentioned in the curriculum framework are the FDIC. Remember, these are the guys that insure bank accounts. FDIC introduced to avoid bank rushes that would happen whenever there was an economic downturn. It's introduced after what's called the bank holiday. The bank holiday is 4 days long, when FDR basically says we're going to shut down all the banks and only open up banks that are solvent and able to keep running, so the FDIC isn't paying for everything else. FDIC is still around today. I think it's $250,000 they will insure your money for. Social Security, meant to help the elderly, disabled, and widowed. It's meant to be a supplement to retirement, although today it's starting to morph into some people's only means of retirement. Again, this is a program still around today. It is underfunded, which we'll talk about more and more as we get closer to the modern day. But it just called Scott Scoot. I'm sure that's not going to start anything. So Social Security is still around today. Then you need to know your impact of radicals and unions. Essentially, they take the New Deal and they try to push it even further than what Roosevelt first wants. You have Huey Long and the idea of share our wealth, where he wants more of the wealthy to pay taxes to help out the underclass, to help them move forward. So that's your impact of radicals and unions, and I will stop and wait for questions on the Great Depression. Tent cities. Maddie asked about tent cities. That is, sorry, Jacob. Tent cities are essentially where homeless people would live after the Great Depression, when you lost everything. You had nothing to live in but a tent, and they would tend to congregate together in cities. Claiming Social Security being underfunded, that's you could do a college course on that. Government needs to pay for something. They borrow money from Social Security because it's stuff that you need down the road, and it's not going to hurt anybody now. So instead of just having the money to build a road right away, and raising money specifically for that road, they take money from you and I in the future and build that road. Rebecca, the impact of radicals and unions. You just need to know that they are going to push FDR for even more help. They're going to push for even more kind of social welfare from the government, and they want the New Deal to expand further. So at this point, World War II, things to know there. Again, the isolationism in the beginning. We figure we're dealing with the Great Depression. We need to just deal with that and let Europe be Europe's problem. But we do some small things. We first pass the Neutrality Act, then decide that we're going to be the arsenal of democracy, and pass legislation that allows us to trade with the Allied side and against the Germans. This isolationism is going to cause us to essentially be the arsenal of democracy. We're going to make war materials to sell to Europe, and once we get involved in the war after Pearl Harbor, then essentially everybody's going to have a job and the Depression is over. So again, a lot of argument over whether or not the New Deal actually helped us get out of the Depression, or if World War II is what got us out of the Depression. Most people lean nowadays to World War II getting us out of the Depression because everybody had a job. Either you picked up a rifle and went to fight, or you went to a factory and worked. So remember, this total employment from the total war is going to give us images like Rosie the Riveter, as women enter factories to work. Also, something I forgot to mention back with World War II or World War One. Remember, that's when women enter the factories and then come out, fight for more rights, and get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. Also a part of Total War, you have the idea of rationing and these bond drives where they try to convince people that, hey, if you, um, you know, even if you can't fight, you can contribute to the war. Everything that you save, um, everything that you saves helps our soldiers overseas. So you have this active role. And again, this is why a lot of people call this the greatest generation. They say that this is the generation that saved the world from tyranny. They fought off Hitler, and they sacrificed everything to help the United States win the war. Whereas today we have two wars ongoing at the moment, and I guarantee you nobody shut their lights off for any period of time today in order to conserve energy, so we can send things over to our troops fighting in Iraq or Afghanistan. Then you need to remember with World War II, D-Day is the decisive moment in Europe. Know about island hopping and those issues in the Pacific. Know the Manhattan Project, which developed the bomb that's dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And also know the American role in this war. This is kind of the opposite of World War One, where World War One we were just the fat guys that came over and helped out. World War II is when we take a very, very prominent role in the war and are going to actively help to end it, as opposed to just sending numbers and fat people. For the post-war period, for now, we're obviously going to cover this more into period 8. For now, you need to know about the fallout from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Know that the effects wear on for a few years. You need to know that the United Nations is created out of World War II. You need to know the Nuremberg trials, where the Nazis are put on trial for war crimes. Also, some Japanese put on trial for war crimes. You have to know about the different conferences that happen afterwards. And the last thing you need to know post-war is kind of this setup for the Cold War. You need to know about the sectioning of Germany, the sectioning of Berlin, and how now our focus shifts from the evils of Hitler, Mussolini, and fascists, and shifts over to the Soviets and communists. So where Truman starts to move into the policy of containment as a foreign policy. Also know for post-war, this is kind of what takes America out of its shell. This is when we decide we're going to be a superpower. We're going to stick our nose in everybody else's business and become a major world leader. Rebecca's asking which trials put the Germans on trial. That's the Nuremberg trials. Jacob is asking, so both world wars were total wars, and about the sentiment of the country for each war. Yes, both world wars are total wars. There is much more support for World War II than there is for World War One. World War One, remember, happens entirely in Europe and Asia. There is no fighting on America's doorstep. World War II, the beginning of it sees the largest anti-war movement, or at least isolation movement, in the United States. It becomes 800,000 strong, and then Pearl Harbor happens. Once Pearl Harbor happens, we are pretty much all in on World War II. You don't see a whole lot of resistance there. So two is definitely more supported and more involved than World War One. All right, so I'll answer other World War II questions as they come in, or just overall questions as they come in. Maddie's asking how Berlin was split and between who. Remember, Berlin is in the Soviet-held territory. It's split into 4 sections: American, French, British, and Soviet. But the American, French, and British section, they all work together. They're all democracies. So it's essentially one big section that covers 3/4 of Berlin. The Soviet section is isolated from the rest of Berlin. And that's where you're going to start having conflict between the democracies and the communist republics. Clayman asked World War One if they did that because the generation was soft. No, Clayman, remember that's the Spanish-American War. Roosevelt actually came out and gave speeches about how soft Americans had become at that point. So for tomorrow, I'm looking out my window, seeing a bunch of snow blowing and growing higher and higher every second. So I'm assuming that we're not in tomorrow. I don't think that's too much of a stretch. Tomorrow, 2 o'clock, I will remember to plug my headphones in before I start the Hangout window. That's terrible, Scott. That's why you never get retweeted. Or favorited, I guess. So tomorrow we'll start on period 8 and go forward from there. Today's did not count as an assignment credit. Tomorrow's will count as an assignment credit. We'll talk after your test about if we want to keep doing this. I am not a communist, Jess. I am a totalitarian dictator. So I will see you guys again at 2 o'clock tomorrow to start discussing period 8. Tomorrow will count as a 10-point assignment grade. Rebecca asked about the Turner Frontier thesis. Yes, you need to know the Turner Frontier thesis. You need to know who Frederick Jackson Turner is, and you need to know the main idea of the thesis. Jess, the difference between communism and dictatorships. Communism, remember, is supposed to be everything collectively owned by everyone. Communism tends to become a dictatorship. A dictatorship is simply the rule of one or the rule of very, very few in power. Communism tends to become a dictatorship. I mean, Animal Farm really isn't that far off. Yes, Ramirez, I am making sure that the shrubs are okay in the snow. My children, though, I think might be buried under it somewhere. I'm not really sure. Austin asked if Monday was going to be short answer and Tuesday multiple choice. That is correct, Austin. Monday short answer, Tuesday multiple choice. Dan, stop begging. It's not a good look for you. Jess, Cuba is considered a communist dictatorship. Lucy, we're not going to have school tomorrow, but if we if we do have school tomorrow and we're not delayed somehow, we would have the test. So only if it's a full day will we have the test. And just know none of these, we call them communist dictatorships. If you asked Castro what kind of government Cuba has, he would say they are a communist country. The dictatorship is something that Western countries tend to add to it almost derisively, because while they advocate communism as a means where everybody is doing everything, the dictatorship part is something that everyone else notices because there is one person with all the control when everybody is supposed to have the control. I wouldn't shovel now, Dan. You'll have to do it again later. I have a snowblower though, so I'm not too worried about it. Hopefully, it'll uncover my two kids outside. You guys do know that just shoveling once early in the storm doesn't mean you won't have to do it again, right? Jess, communism being different from a true republic. Communism, remember, is communism is where everybody owns everything. A true republic is usually capitalist. So it has to do with the economic system, and communism usually doesn't have people that are elected. Usually they rise to power or appoint themselves. Republic people are voted on. All right, I'm going to sign off the webcast and just answer questions in chat if you guys have any more.